Hello, good afternoon, Tanse, and welcome to APTN InFocus. I'm Daryl Stranger. Today we're putting podcasts made by and for Indigenous people in focus. From the Dene Yati podcast to Driving While Indigenous, we're taking a look at how First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples are telling their stories through podcasts. And as always, we want you to join in on our conversation. You can tweet us at APTN InFocus on Twitter, or you can email infocus@aptn.ca. All right, let's get right into it, really. Our first guest is the host of the podcast Driving While Indigenous, Jill Featherstone, and Jill joins me here now. Jill, thank you so much for joining us here in studio.
Thank you for having me.
So, first off, can you just tell us about your podcast?
Well, my podcast is called Driving While Indigenous, and it's a podcast which highlights Indigenous voices, amplifies Indigenous voices, and really gives energy to all of the amazing things that people are doing, chasing dreams, blazing trails, all of that kind of stuff.
So, what made you decide to want to do this and then, get into podcasting? Or was podcasting something that, you weren't wanting to get into and you're just doing this on, for fun type of thing, and it turned into that? Like, how did all this start?
Well, I am an avid listener of podcasts. I've always listened to podcasts, and I've always dreamed of having my own podcast. And probably about 4 years ago, I started developing the idea of having a podcast. I was hashing out all the plans. I was creating, the way it was going to look. And then I got scared. And then that fear just stopped me in my tracks. Fear of judgment, fear of vulnerability, and fear of just going into the unknown. And so I put it aside, and 4 years later, I've done a lot of work on myself, and I really felt ready. I really felt that it was time, and I was ready to step into this new venture.
So what sort of got you over the hump, the proverbial hump, so to speak, of, okay, like, I'm ready to do this? You said you did some work on yourself.
Yeah.
So you really felt like now was the time type of thing? Is that, and so what sort of helped you with that?
Well, a lot of my big fears were lateral violence. Fear of people judging me and, laughing. And I really, really had to do my work on getting over lateral violence. And I even talk about it in, I think, episode 4, which is entitled, What Other People Think About You Is None of Your Business. So I really had to, give myself those own lessons. Like, it doesn't matter if other people are laughing at you. You can't give your attention to the one person that is poking fun at you when there's 1,000 other people cheering you on.
Yeah.
We can't keep looking at the one negative. And once I was really, really able to be comfortable with that, I felt ready to step into this podcasting, because, that one person may not need what's in the podcast, but those 1,000 other people, they want to hear those messages. Well, they're ready for those messages.
That is really well said. I don't think you could have put that any better, and that's certainly great advice too, in a sense. Yeah. So with your podcast, how did you come up with the name Driving While Indigenous? I'd love to hear this.
Okay. I do motivational workshops for youth and young adults, and I also train community service providers to do my workshop Awaken the Spirit. And I was in a training one day. I had community service providers from different communities come, and there was this one young man in there. His name is Blake Shingoose, and he was talking about all of our challenges. As Indigenous people, we have just this extra layer of challenges in anything that we want to do in life, in basically anything. And then he said, it's like driving while Indigenous. And like when he said that, I just started laughing, because it just really struck me. It resonated within, and it's just this great metaphor for everything that we do. It's like there is an extra layer of challenges. Like, we're all going blindly into all of our different ventures all of the time.
We really are, yeah. And so why is it important for Indigenous people to tell our stories? Like, why is that so important?
Because our stories empower other people. It's, you know, if we can find ourselves in another person, if we can relate to another person, then it empowers us. And then we feel like we're not alone. Because so many of us feel like we're alone. And so then we feel like we're not alone and we're in this together. And that's basically what it does. Like it creates like a sense of community, especially right now, like during, you know, we just got over COVID and people were so isolated, and it kind of gives you this sense of, I'm not alone. Yeah. I'll give you an example. My daughter listened to my podcast, and then she's like, wow, it felt like you were talking just to me. It felt like it was just you and I having a conversation, and you were telling me everything I needed. And then she's like, is that the power of podcasting? And I said, yeah, it is. It really feels like that person is speaking to you.
So is that something, once you started doing this, that you were trying to do, is make it personable and make it so that each person, like you had said, felt like, wow, like I really feel like she's speaking to me? Is that something that you were trying to do, or is that just sort of the result of what's happening with your podcast?
I really feel like it's always been something that I've been aware of. I'm very aware that there are, you know, all different types of people out there, and so I try to choose people that have very diverse backgrounds. I don't want to just stick to mainly entrepreneurs. I want to interview athletes and musicians, artists, people that have overcome something, because I know that there's so many other people out there, and I just want each person to be able to find some type of takeaway.
So in the episodes you've done, is there one or two or any that stand out above the others for you?
Well, right now what I'm finding is that no one episode has stood out, but I'm finding that I'm taking personal takeaways from each of the episodes. Somebody during one episode will say something that will stay with me. One example is in my second episode with Amy Jackson of Native Love Notes. She shares that, you know, when we try something new, we either can be scared or we can be excited. And we have to make that choice. Am I going to be afraid or am I going to be excited? So now when I face fears, I can ask myself, am I going to choose to be scared or am I going to choose to be excited? So it's like little anecdotes that each person can take away. So I'm getting these from each of the episodes.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because we took something away from that episode too, actually, with Native Love Notes. And one of the things that stood out to us with Amy Jackson in that Native Love Notes was, we're just going to play a little clip from there, and then we'll let the audience see what stood out for us. So let's go to that clip now.
What are your most popular slogans and your biggest sellers, and what are the people responding to the most right now?
So one of the cool things about Native slang, what I realized, is that we all share certain phrases. I mean, like for real, like I'm talking like our cousins out in New Zealand and Australia also use this slang.
Oh, wow.
I'm talking like Polynesian island folks use this slang, like our Samoan cousins out there, you know, like we have like cousins down in Mexico and South America that use slang. Like we all use 3 slang I've noticed, and the 3 is deadly, not even, and ever sick.
Oh my goodness, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so those 3 products, anything with those 3, you know, slang words go all over the world.
So what's next for you and for Driving While Indigenous? What's coming up here? What are we looking at?
Well, Driving While Indigenous, the podcast, airs every Monday, but there's also going to be a Driving While Indigenous live event. So,
really?
Yeah, so on December 2nd, I'm bringing together a mixture of entrepreneurs, motivational speakers, athletes, musicians, and comedians. And it's just going to be a full day of inspiration and motivation. And then we're going to end the evening with a gala. And yeah, it's just going to be a really big event. And it's really there to celebrate it's just to celebrate each other. You know, it's not meant to highlight the people that are on stage, but rather us on stage are going to be able to celebrate the people in the audience, because it's their dreams that we're trying to uplift.
So that's going to be a public thing, and is that what's happening?
Well, it's ticketed.
Okay,
yeah. So you pay you can buy tables or individual seats, and it starts at like 9 o'clock, and we're going to have lunch together, and then we're going to have a break in the evening, and then we're going to have dinner together, and it's going to be like just this extraordinary day. And it's like a full day. It's from 9 a.m. till 12 a.m., just like this full day.
So if people wanted to get involved in this, how do they do that?
They could visit www.jillfeatherstone.com, and then there's like all of the details are there. Okay,
great. And before we let you go, just on the podcast, where can people tune in and listen to Driving While Indigenous?
Anywhere that you listen to podcasts, so Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, any podcast platform, you can tune in.
Okay, great. Well, that's all I have for you, Jill. So I want to thank you for coming in again. It's always nice to speak with somebody in person, and especially about this. I mean, this is such a great podcast, and what you do is just so wonderful. So thank you so much, and good luck the rest of the way with your podcast.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, we have to take a short break, but still to come, we'll speak with two folks from a podcast dedicated entirely to Indigenous languages.
Join our conversation now. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page, follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus, and send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back to APTN in Focus. We're putting podcasts, Indigenous podcasts, in focus today, and our next guests are involved with a very new podcast called Pikiskwêwin. It's an Indigenous language podcast that was started only a few months ago by the First Nations University of Canada and language speakers. Joining us now are Felicia Dewar and Natalie Langen, but before that, here's a quick clip from one of the episodes.
Raninsigo kakanadano imaganak. Natalie Langen it is in Kasigo Kansigano Sayoning Noenzi. May got the Surajan there. Aptigon Ganazik and Damnungum, and his Kamutsukato. Uni Pinsigo. Nungum met Nauki is gone up at the Nipanauki is not so. Game no often. Nimisto me a mappe. We begin a doma. So no my go get the piston. The sassimitiness go sip upon it. Up to go get Gina and the matter. Nimisto me. I'm just musical my we begin.
Felicia, Natalie, thank you both so much for being here. I'll start with Felicia, I guess, and can you sort of explain what is Pikiskwêwin? I hope I'm saying that right.
You are. It's really good. Thank you. Pikiskwêwin is actually a project of podcasts. And what we're doing is we're creating podcasts in different Indigenous languages for our language learners, our language keepers, those that are interested in revitalizing the languages and keeping them going, preserving them for posterity, so to speak. And so this was a funded grant from the Government of Canada that our First Nations University Assistant Professor Shannon Avison had applied for. And as we're aware, they're very instrumental in helping support those of us who are working in the language space.
So how did this start, and how did you both get involved? I'll kind of open it up to the both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, Shannon Avison from the First Nations University of Canada had applied for the government grant. And when it was granted, she started to build a team out of folks that could help produce the podcast, could help reach out to language keepers. We started developing what the project would look like. We went through some strategic brainstorming and decided, who we were designing these podcasts for and how we were going going to contact those that are the keepers of the various languages that we have. And then we started recruiting podcasters, just folks that we knew were, interested in language and preserving the languages. And Natalie was one of those folks that we ran into that's just an amazing representative for the Saulteaux Nation. And we asked her if she would come on board, if she had some ideas for a podcast. And so I'll let Natalie explain that. But that's basically the rundown of how it got started. Yeah. Yeah,
Natalie, how did you, how did you get involved, and sort of when you heard about it, what was your thoughts?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm from Treaty 4 area, which is predominantly a Cree and Saulteaux Nation here in Saskatchewan. Now, I'm from Fishing Lake First Nation, and that is a Saulteaux community. And I've known Shannon throughout a number of years, just from, being a university student back in the day. And she had this idea of this vision, rather, of the Pikiskwêwin coming to life. And she knew that I had a background in Saulteaux, that I was at one time or another a fluent speaker. And she approached me with the idea. And of course, I was absolutely thrilled and really wanted to be a part of her vision. And of course, and now it's come to life. And I do the Saulteaux portion of the podcasting on Pikiskwêwin.
So can you tell us a bit about your podcast and sort of what people can expect from it, and what you hope to bring to it?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I was raised in Fishing Lake First Nation, which is predominantly Saulteaux. And for my family, Saulteaux language and traditions and culture have always been their first way of life. So, and I was raised by my paternal grandmother, who only knew how to speak and live by the Saulteaux ways. There was never any English in our home. So Saulteaux was my first language. And as I got older, or I should just back up here for a second. So growing up, the language was very, very strong in our home. All of the grandchildren, the aunties and uncles, everybody in our family were very fluent speakers and lived by our culture and our traditional ways. And it wasn't until that our matriarch, our grandmother, had passed away. And when she had passed away, I felt like a lot of our traditions and language, just dissipated as, when she passed. And it's been 20 years now since she's passed. And so when this project came to life, I knew that this was going to be my opportunity to revive my language. And that's exactly what I've done. So I want to teach people and show people that no matter how many years go by, you can relearn your language, you can relearn your culture, you can get in touch with those ways again. And it's not anything that you should be intimidated by. It is very rich, it is very accepting, and I think that's what we need to do. So my podcasts are going back, and I am interviewing all of the leaders that influenced me in the culture and in the language. So my podcast focuses a lot on leadership and how the people that influenced me talk about the people that influenced them. So that's my podcast is about leadership.
And I'll open this up to the both of you again, whoever wants to speak first. Why is it, I guess, important to have a podcast series like this? I mean, there's other, podcasts about different languages and that sort of thing, but why is it important that there's maybe this series of podcasts?
Well, I think Natalie definitely has some views on that as well, but I'll just say for me, so I grew up in northern Alberta, and I have familial ties to Sucker Creek First Nation, which is Cree. We have a lot of Cree speakers, but not my family. My family are all, residential school survivors, or they're 60s scoop, or both. And so they lost their language. It was something that they were taught to be ashamed of. And for us, our language is so intrinsically tied to our culture and to our identity and to who we are. And so I know for me, being involved in this project, these podcasts are so important to help those of us that do want to learn or relearn our language, so that we can claim back our language, claim our identity, claim our culture, and get a better understanding, of our traditions and our values through the language. And so without having podcasts like these, especially ones that are working with the endangered languages like the Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, I mean, it's very difficult to find resources, to help folks. And if you are, a 60s scoop survivor or someone that has been taken away from their culture, how do you find those ties back? How do you find the way back? And so we're just trying to help that. We're trying to preserve that for future generations by creating these podcasts. Natalie, did you have more thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So it wasn't until I started doing the podcast that I was actually named a language keeper. And that was something that really, really hit home to me. That was, I never saw it in that light. But now as, time is going on and, my generation, we're getting older, and the younger generation, especially I know back home in my community, they're not fluent speakers. The fluent speakers are really dropping like flies, and we need to have a place, especially now in this day and age when technology is so huge and surrounds us. This is a great way for them to tune into Pikiskwêwin, and where all the language is stored. They can access it from any device, anywhere they are, and they can tune in and they can listen to these languages. And it's, once they listen to the language and realize, hey, my late grandmother was a fluent Saulteaux speaker. This is really nice. I should start learning Saulteaux. So it's a hope, it's a way, it's a means that this is going to reach out to people to want to learn and relearn their language.
Well, and part of that is this is all still a relatively new podcast, right? Like Pikiskwêwin is very new. It started this year. So maybe what are some of the ups and downs of it being so new? Like, it's new in the sense that, it's fresh and exciting and stuff, but maybe what are some of the maybe ups and downs of starting something like this?
That's a really great question. We've had quite a few of both, as I'm sure you can imagine. One of the greatest ups has really been getting to meet the various folks in the community that are language keepers, are language learners, and just to see and feel and hear the passion that they have for sharing their languages. We've worked with quite a few elders who have really just come on board and learned the technology. You would have thought that would have been a really difficult process. It hasn't been. They've really keen to share and keen to share with future generations and recognize that this is a way a different way that they can reach people that they may not know. And so we've had some folks that have really just embraced the opportunity to learn the technology for podcasting, for recording and producing, which has been fantastic. But, Natalie spoke about how we are losing elders and language keepers, and this spring we lost 2 already. We did lose Alex Pelletier, who is the host of our Mama Sa Cuisine, which is a Métis cooking show, and just a beautiful spirit and a beautiful force of nature. And we lost him this spring, but we had already recorded 6 episodes with him, and we were able to provide that for his family so that they can have that, hear his voice, hear his laugh, and keep that. And that's really we're so thankful and humbled to be able to do that. We also lost a very young language keeper, language learner in Mercedes Redmond. She also passed this spring, and she had created a series on food sovereignty. We chose Ani, and with her grandmother. And again, it was a real gift to have those recorded and be able to present those to her family. So yeah, we've definitely seen our share of both.
And Natalie, I'll get you to jump in there as well, just maybe some ups and downs from your perspective of starting something new like this. And you just want to jump in there?
For sure. Well, for myself, personally speaking, for me, it was a little bit of the intimidation and, wondering if this was something that I could really do. And I did doubt myself a bit because it's been nearly 20 years since I was in a fluent state of mind. And it really took a lot of learning, a lot of dedication, a lot of hours in. Like, if this is something you want to do, you really have to dedicate yourself to learn this language. And for me, that was one of my biggest challenges, was just, getting over my own fear. And once I was able to do that, then I was able to reach out to my extended family who are fluent speakers. And it's been nothing but support from them going forward. And I think for me, that was my biggest challenge. I've learned a lot of things since joining Pikiskwêwin, learning how to do the whole producing part of it. Like, it's just such a great team. And for a lot of us, like, this isn't, this is totally out of our comfort zone, dealing with this type of technology. So it was a lot of learning. It's been a fun adventure, and it really tests to see what you are capable of. And it's just been fun, and it's been great. And then I guess another challenging part for me is the Soto speakers that I can reach out to. There's not very many that I can reach out to anymore. So it's like trying to get as many interviews or as many recordings as done in a very small, time frame here, just to making sure that everything is preserved and recorded so that I can pass that on and share it and teach it as well.
Well, before I let the two of you go, I just have two rapid fire questions, and maybe either of you can answer. Is this something that will be continued in the future, first off?
Absolutely. It is. It's still ongoing. We are continuously working on, the new podcasts, the blogging, all of that. I know it's for as long as I can do this, I am committed to doing this. So I think Pikiskwêwin is here to stay and in for the long run, for sure.
Well, that's great to hear. That's wonderful to hear. And just lastly here, and then we'll let you go, where can we find and listen to the podcasts?
Absolutely. So we do have them all listed on our website. You can listen straight on our website, which is pikiskwêwin.ca. And then you can also find them where you would normally find your podcasts. So on Amazon, on Spotify, Google, all the great places.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. We're going to have to leave it there, guys. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing this new adventure with us and explaining a little bit about it. So we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Miigwech, to both of you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
And joining me now is Pam Palmater. Pam is Mi'kmaq from the Eel River Bar First Nation. Her podcast, Warrior Life, addresses a range of Indigenous issues from empty political promises and ongoing racism and many other topics. Here's just a little snippet of her podcast.
After 500 years of genocide, Indigenous peoples are still here, asserting, living, and defending our sovereignty all over Turtle Island. We have never ceded, surrendered, or extinguished the lands, waters, or resources in our territories, and this is exactly why we are targets for state-based violence, exploitation, and criminalization. You'll hear from Indigenous land defenders, water protectors, and advocates who call on us to take collective action to protect our peoples and the planet.
Pam, thanks for being here. First off, can you just sort of explain to our viewers who might not know what your podcast is?
So I have a podcast called the Warrior Life Podcast, and it's been ongoing for, I think, 2 or 3 years. I have over 100 episodes, and the main purpose of it is to lift up the voices of Native people all over Turtle Island doing big things for our people. So it could be land defenders, water protectors, it could be human rights advocates, it could be lawyers, it could be academics, it could be grannies on the front lines of trying to stop mines. It's basically all of those people who love our people so much that they dedicate their lives to standing up for our rights.
So you just mentioned you've been doing this for about 2 or 3 years now. So what in the beginning sort of got you to be like, hey, let's make a podcast about this?
Well, that's a really good question, because in the beginning, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do the podcast. I know I wanted to feature the amazing things that our people are doing so that there's like good news stories too. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it should just be me talking in these podcasts. But as soon as I ended up talking to other people, I was like, okay, I'm hooked. It's got to be hearing from other people's voices. And even though they talk about difficult things, they always end with some kind of hope for the future and a call to action. And so really my podcast is, education about Indigenous peoples, but for the purpose of action.
So what have you learned, I guess, since you started doing this or doing your podcast? I mean, you've only been doing it, again, for like 2 or 3 years. So what have you learned in that amount of time?
I have learned so much. Imagine being able to sit down at the table on the res in every single community and learn from a community leader or an elder or an activist or someone blazing trails about their life story, how they got to where they are, all of their challenges, the things that are going well, why they're so passionate about standing up for kids' rights, for example, or the land or the water, and then how they see what we need to do in the future. So these calls to action, not just for the Canadian public, but also for us as between nations. And so I've learned everything about what it means to be a leader, a traditional leader, an elected leader, what it means to be a warrior on the ground in terms of it's all about love for your people. It's not violence. I mean, you could write multiple books out of this podcast from all of the information that they shared. And
just sort of on what you had just mentioned, I mean, is your podcast sort of what you envisioned it to be when you first started, or has it sort of just gone beyond your expectations a little bit, maybe?
It's beyond my expectations. To me, it's beyond a podcast because I get to talk to everyone that I've looked up to as I was growing up, all of the younger generation that's coming up now who are leaders and warriors. Like, I have learned so much, and it helps me with my activism or my relationships with Indigenous peoples. And also the fact that it has become an educational tool, I didn't quite expect that. I thought this would be more of a conversation amongst Native people, but it turns out professors are using that in their classrooms to better understand from Indigenous voices what's happening in Wet'suwet'en territory or Haida territory or Mi'kmaq territory, the kind of stuff you don't get from the media, because my podcasts are about an hour long. So you really get to hear from the people on the ground, and it's another perspective.
So I wanted to ask, in all of the different, interviews and episodes you've done in your time doing podcasts or your podcast, is there anything that maybe stands out above the rest for you?
Yeah, that's really hard. There's just been so many amazing people. I think the podcast interview that I did with Beatrice Hunter, she's an Innu from the East Coast. They were trying to stop the destruction of their lands and waters. Listening to her experience, hearing about her absolute fright and dread of the RCMP, how they treated her, the fact that she thought she was never going to come back home alive. Like, we're talking about real experiences by people on the ground. She was a grandmother out there just trying to protect the land, and she ended up in a men's prison. Like, it's just incredible. It shows the grave injustices about what's happening, and you can pick out those themes in every podcast that's done about all of the injustices, the failure of Canada to address them, despite the fact that we have all of these solutions. And so there's a lot of them I'm impacted by, but that was probably the most impactful one that I have ever heard.
And Pam, why is it so important that there's Indigenous voices covering stories and sharing these stories in all of these various platforms like podcasting, and somebody might have social media dedicated, stuff like this? Like, why is it so important that these Indigenous issues are covered maybe in a different way?
I think it's really important because think about all of the places and spaces that are occupied by Canadians or Americans or entertainment companies or news media companies, and they're predominantly not us. That's changing. Like, look at APTN, we've got our voices on there and our stories. But there's a multitude of ways of telling stories. So in, say, news reporting, it's reporting on things that have happened or facts or politicians' takes. When it's a podcast, think about how many Native cultures all over the world, in fact, are based on storytelling. So storytelling to say something that's happened, storytelling to say lessons that are learned or warnings or values in there, and sometimes just storytelling for entertainment. Well, all of those storytelling ideas and methods and traits of Native people all just shine in a podcast. So it's not about, you know, we need to report this, I need to ask you these very specific questions to make sure we get all the facts out. It's basically saying, you say what you think is important about these issues. What do you think people should know? Sometimes I can guess what that's going to be, and at other times I'm really just blown away by the different issues that we don't always consider. And I think that's invaluable. It's literally capturing forever the voices of elders and activists and all of that in real time, instead of, you know, a book that was written 30 years ago, for example, and you hope that someone reads it again. And the other thing about podcasts and native voices is that we're reaching people where they are. So, you know, media changes, social media changes. Well, if the new wave now is podcasts and it's booming, then we need to reach people where they are.
Well, before we let you go, Pam, there's also a Warriors Kids podcast now, right? So can you sort of tell us a little bit about that? And yeah, just tell us about the Warriors Kids podcast.
Oh, so I love this Warrior Kids podcast. It won the award for Best Narrated Audio last year at Imaginative. And I was just so proud of it because as I was doing all of these adult podcasts, I would get comments over social media about what they liked or what they didn't like and suggestions for guests. And often I got this comment saying, oh, it's too bad there wasn't something like this for kids, something that kids could understand so that they don't have to wait until high school to learn about Native issues. And this was coming from Native people and non-Native people. And I thought, why isn't there? So I did a whole bunch of research, couldn't find a single kids podcast that was done by Native people for Native people about our issues. So I thought, well, I better just get in there. And honestly, that has been so much fun because it's not as heavy and you get to have fun, you get to incorporate stories, you get to just do a lot of fun things at a kid level while at the same time teaching them age-appropriate issues about Native people, and then always making a call to action, always asking the question, hey, Warrior Kids, what can you do about this injustice? Right. Is it write a letter? Is it draw a picture? Like, what is it? And so, like, I love that the two are so related.
And just lastly here, where can we find your podcast, Pam?
The easiest way is on my website, pampalmater.com, in case you want to see all of my content. But both podcasts are on every podcast app you could imagine, whether it's Spotify or Apple iTunes or like wherever you listen to podcasts, you'll find both of those podcasts.
All right, perfect. We're going to have to leave it there, Pam, but thank you so much for jumping on here and sharing a little bit about both your podcasts, and we really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.
All right, it's time for one final break here on APTN in Focus. Don't go anywhere. We have more podcast talk coming up. Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Joining us now is Willis Janvier, the host of Dene Yati. His podcast is about sharing the Dene language through stories and education for people new and old to the language.
You know, it's all over the world now. Dene Yati podcast. The one time, a couple of years ago, I remember Russia. Linguist Helnia. You've got a beautiful language, Shini. Thank you for your podcast.
Willis, thanks so much for being here on APTN in Focus, talking all about podcasts. And you have a podcast, so tell us about Dene Yati.
First of all, I'll just introduce myself. See, Willis Janvier Hushet, Telas Tours in Launch, Saskatchewan, Clearwater River Dene Nation, band member, and doing Zinige Treaty 4 territories, Alun Tatida. So, my name is Willis Jambi. I'm from the Losh and Clearwater River Dene Nation band member, and I live in Moose Jaw in the Treaty 4 territory. So back in 2020 of November, I started Dene Yati podcast. How it started was just to hear the language and have fun. During the pandemic, a lot of people were going through, staying home and all that stuff. So I would find content on Facebook and then, do everything. It was like a radio thing I created. Like I called myself Willie FM in the beginning, and but the main focus was to do it in the language, in the Dene language. So that's what Dene Yati, from the beginning.
Well, and you speak mainly Dene on your show, like you were talking about. So what sort of motivated you to create a Dene language podcast?
When it comes to Dene, you're not able to hear the language everywhere. I moved away from home when I was 18. I lived in Fort McMurray. I didn't always have access. I was always working with non-Indigenous people or non-Dene people. The only time would be when I call home. So I would be traveling on the road. I'd YouTube Dene language or anything because I was curious about the Denes up in Northwest Territories and, how maybe the languages. So, years later, that was really the main reason that kept me going was, people really enjoyed hearing the language and just putting that content out there. And now you can, kind of Google Dene language or Dene Yati, and it'll come up. You'll hear stories from all over North America now.
And I wanted to ask, like, who taught you Dene, or how did you come about speaking Dene?
It's my first language, so I was just raised, with the language at home. The only time we would speak English when we were kids was at school, with most of the teachers being non-Dene. But now, my hometown, they've got a large number of Dene-speaking teachers now, which is good. But yeah, Dene is my first language, and English is number 2.
Well, that's awesome to hear. And in one of your most recent podcasts, you asked your listeners, what is the importance of Indigenous storytelling? And I'm going to turn that around on you and sort of ask you, what is the importance of Indigenous storytelling?
There's so many stories that I've learned in the couple of years that I'm doing this that I wouldn't even have ever found anywhere, which is true. And the importance of it is passing it on and sharing to people, but it's in the language. People love hearing the language. You get to pass on 2 things. Maybe it's a story, piece of knowledge, piece of history from somewhere. And, one of the things I always share, late Morris Nayeli, I've had him, he kind of became friends. He's passed on now, but I wish our dialects were good. The same, so we can have that conversation, but a lot of them turn out to be English. But he shared a lot of their legends and stories with me that I'm going to carry and I'm going to share with people. So that is really important to not only pass on the language, but the stories for just people to hear and listen to learn from.
And that leads right into my next question: is what do you hope your listeners take away, from your podcasts?
I just hope, they learn at least one thing, and to keep that curiosity alive in who they are, or, because as Dene people, we're all over the north. There's not just where I'm from. And that's what keeps me going, too, because I'm always curious of learning about the Satu and Deline or the Gwich'in, and I'd like to reach the Alaskan Dene people, and all that, to just keep that curiosity alive and keep learning more about whatever we can pass on, because that's really what it's all about.
And you just touched on it right at the end of your answer there. So where do you see your podcast going, or where do you hope your podcast goes? Do you have sort of a vision in mind, or are you just sort of doing it and seeing what happens?
I never thought I'd be here 2 years talking to you. If you go to my YouTube channel, I got a couple videos on an iPad. I don't know where I'm going. I can't, but I know I will keep going. Where it's going to go, where to take me. It's taken me to travel. One of the big things was seeing the Pope, not seeing the Pope, but hearing the stories of people who attended these schools in Dene, and to be able to share that, or, to travel to, speaking to some social studies teachers. I never thought I'd be there. So, keep doing it, keep sharing my language, our language, and we'll see where it goes. There's no destination, really.
So then, were you sort of surprised, I guess, at the reaction that your podcast did get? Or when you look back on these last few years, are you sort of surprised at how much traction it's gained and the audience it's reached?
Yeah, for sure. In the beginning, I gone through some times where I didn't want to do it anymore, because I was really enjoying it, but also I wanted to work, for sure. I wanted it to work, and I put a lot of time, effort in it, and doing school, university online. And there are times where I was like, I don't want to keep going. So, in regards to mental health and dealing with that stuff, I would always get a message or an email. One of the emails came from Russia, and the guy said, thank you for sharing your language. You have a beautiful language. He's a linguist in Russia. I didn't expect that, the kid has been in foster care that said, hey, thanks for your podcast. I was in the system. Now I'm trying to reconnect and learn the language. So anytime that I've gone through any kind of adversity, it comes at me. So, it feels like I just got to keep going, because someone's getting something. I don't know what it is for them, but, I'm happy to provide that for them. But, so...
Well, that's amazing. And you feature Indigenous people from all over the country. I wanted to ask, in all the time you've done this, are there any episodes that maybe stand out for you personally?
A little bit of everything from everywhere. Like I mentioned, the curiosity thing, always learning. Maybe it's the origins of my language. I am fluent, but some of the origins or the legends from the Northwest Territories, I've had the Dene Navajo people. They are part of the Dene people. So kind of putting it all together, I wouldn't point out anybody, but there's always one little thing that, you can learn from each one. That's what I've learned, and one of the things was that I always share is Tulu. For us is road, Tulu. And when you break it down, tu is water, lu is frozen. Frozen water, that's what our highways were back in the day. We still use that today, right? And I learned that from one of my friends now from Manitoba, Lac Brochet. So, there's so many of those little things that make you go, wow, that you use it all the time, but you don't know. And it's like a giant puzzle, honestly, a giant puzzle.
Learning something new every time, it seems. And we're running a bit short on time here, Willis, but I want to ask this last question for all of those who are watching and listening at home. Where can they listen to your show?
So I stream live on Facebook and YouTube. I'm kind of maybe going through a transition right now where I might just switch to YouTube, but you can watch on Dene Yati podcast, YouTube or Facebook, mainly Facebook. We're all on Facebook. Everybody, it's just a part of us, but a lot of the audience is there. And you can get it on your mobile device, wherever you get it, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Cast, I believe. There's a few other ones, but those are the main ones. And let's hit that like or subscribe button.
I'm sure a few people that are watching this certainly will do that. Willis, we appreciate your time, and I want to say a big thank you, Miigwech, for taking some time for us today and sharing a bit of your story.
Hey, Masi Cho, have a good day.
All right, that's all we have for you on this segment of APTN in Focus. A big thank you, Miigwech, to all of our guests for joining us here on In Focus. Today's episode will be available as a podcast. You can listen and subscribe on aptnnews.ca/podcasts or find us on your favorite player. And if you missed any episodes and want to catch up, you can find them on aptnnews.ca/infocus. And speaking of podcasts, APTN News has a podcast, so it's perfect time. The APTN National News, brief with Rick Harp. It's a daily update on what's making headlines across the country. You can find that one wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Miigwech, and have a great rest of your day.